Guys? Welcome to Chapter 14, Social Issues. This is the last presentation for this course, but I wanted to get this one in quick because it has information relative to kind of the final assessments, and this is the last thing that you need. Brantford students, you've already heard this content, but this is new content to the Kitchener students. So this PowerPoint presentation is going to be reviewing aspects of Chapter 14 from the textbook, Armed Conflict in a Global Perspective. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this idea of armed conflict. I know you guys can't see me super good. Whatever, it's like 1 in the morning, but everything's quiet. I got some hot tea and I'm ready to go. All right. Love you guys, miss you guys. Hope you're hanging in there. As long as there's been humans, there's been conflict, and war is something that's existed throughout human history. It's had huge impacts on how countries are currently the way they are. It's created and destroyed nations. It's involved incredible atrocities. Right, atrocities just meaning like just the worst of the worst situations imaginable. The Holocaust would be an example. Armed conflict is used to protect. So sometimes it's defensive, sometimes it's to annihilate. Right, as in like say the Nazis in World War II, and sometimes it's to threaten. Like think of what North Korea wanting to have a nuclear weapon, and that's almost all just so that they don't have to play by everybody else's rules. They can threaten their way into better situations, or what they think are better situations. Right, so there's a lot of different motives for engaging in this type of social behavior. It's weird to think of war as a social behavior, but it clearly is. All right, and it's linked to all kinds of other social problems. So let's take a peek. Useful word when we're talking about this is this word state. Okay, and oftentimes you hear state used almost interchangeably with the word country, but that's not always the case, because if you think of something like the Vatican, that's a city-state. So that's like a city that's its own country, kind of. If you look back in the ancient world, there's lots of examples like Athens, Sparta. Those were both examples of places that were basically cities, but their own countries. They had their own military, they had their own government, their own rules. Okay, so a state, they're their own state. A state is an apparatus of power, a set of institutions. The central government, the armed forces, the regulatory and police agencies, whose most important functions include the use of force, the control of territory, and the maintenance of internal order. The state. What's the state? You hear people say that word. One of the themes, and I'm going to go a little bit quicker with this one, just because I want to get it out there to you guys. One of the themes I'm going to be talking about a lot, though, today is this complicated relationship between war and technology. You know, you have the state or the country, or let's just use the Americans as an example. You have the American government heavily subsidizing and heavily supporting industry that's related to war. So whether we're talking about information technology, spy technology, whether we're talking about literally making bombs and tanks and jets, okay, this has an effect of having this huge increase in the destructive capacity of weapons. Right? It also gives new vulnerabilities to these weapons. Why should we have to care what some guy in North Korea is doing? Well, once nuclear weapons are on the scene, it changes the story. It changes, well, it creates new vulnerabilities, is what I say there. All right, the fear of nuclear war leads to military and arms buildup. Right, it's like me and you are at war, and it's a race between us to see who can get the best weapon the fastest. Basically, that's what the Cold War was between the States and Russia, and we're going to be looking at that. So I think the quickest way to explain what a Cold War is, it's a war where the two sides that are kind of the principal participants aren't actually shooting at each other. Right, so it'd be like the States and Russia are doing all these things to try to subvert each other, to try to take advantage of each other, but they're not. They don't want to literally say they're fighting. Part of that's political, both domestically and internationally. Right, so then you get situations like Vietnam where, the Russians are clearly supporting the North Vietnamese. The Americans are clearly, or what the North Vietnamese are called the Viet Cong. The Americans are clearly supporting the South Vietnamese, right? So it's like they're both supplying and funding a different side of the Vietnamese people to fight for their interest. Another word you'll hear is a proxy war. A proxy war would mean like me and you have beef, so we both hire like our friend that's the best fighter and then they fight on our behalf as a proxy to us, a representative of us. I miss talking to you guys. It's not the same reading slides, but we'll do what we can do. It's I don't almost know how to teach without questions, but I'm trying to think of what people might say. But anyways, the Cold War was this state of political military tension, this huge state of tension between what was called the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. So the Eastern Bloc's basically Russia, Czechoslovakia, what used to be called Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany. Right, so the Berlin Wall's in the middle. The east is the Eastern Bloc. Basically, east of the Berlin Wall is the Eastern Bloc, but also Italy. Okay, and then the West includes basically everything that you would think of as the Commonwealth and the States. So it's the States, England, Canada, West Germany, the other side of the wall, and France. So, I explained this the other day when I was talking about test 2, and I picked on D'Angelo, and I'll just do that again today. So say D'Angelo's on the other side of the room from me. We both have a bow and arrow. If you hadn't heard that, D'Angelo, it was this exact same example. So you're on the other side of the room. We're standing, we're pointing the bow and arrow at each other, which we would never do because I love that guy, but theoretically, right? So we both go. I should have taken that drink between takes, and then I set it down right beside the mic oh man, what a rookie move. Anyway, so we're standing across the room, both holding the bow and arrow, pointing at each other. It's like he can shoot, but if he shoots, I'll have time to see that he shot, and then I can shoot. So we're both in the situation that we both have each other in our sights, but if either of us shoots, the other one will have time to shoot. If the Russians send a bomb to New York City, the Americans will have enough time not to stop it, but to send one back to Moscow. Mutually assured destruction. If you take me out, I'm taking you out. This was key with the Cold War, right? And this really this all hit the fan with a thing called the Bay of Pigs, and it was related to that. But another thing, what I meant to say was the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Where the Russians were they had missiles in Cuba. Remember, Cuba's like 90 miles to Florida. It's almost closer from here in Kitchener to Toronto. It's about that distance. Right, so with missiles in Cuba, they could hit New York. They could hit Washington. Right, and there's a cool movie called 12 Days that's about the time between when Kennedy heard about this information, and the Americans all of a sudden were scrambling. They're trying to get spy planes up in the air over top and trying to figure out what was going on and then Kennedy goes on TV and basically does this famous speech, JFK, where he basically says, "Get those missiles out, or we're nuking or it's war, or it's mutually assured destruction. It's hard to imagine how real the threat of nuclear war felt to people in the 70s, when there were these two specific superpowers, the States and Russia. And they were racing to get to the bomb, they were racing to get to the moon. To get to the bomb, I mean to develop the nuclear bomb. So, again, there's some, I sound like an old man, there's some punk in the neighborhood revving his engine. But whatever, kids will be kids. I just hope that doesn't pick up in the audio file. Okay, next slide. So if you're in the digital literacy class, I recently did a presentation where I used a Sam Harris TED Talk, and he was talking about like some of the smartest guys, and he referenced this guy, John von Neumann. All right, so listen to this quote. Mutually assured destruction is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy. So it's a military strategy and a policy related to how to take care of your own country, national security. So it's a army strategy and a defense strategy. Mutually assured destruction is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy in which a full-scale use of nuclear weapons by two or more opposing sides would cause the complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. If Moscow shoots at New York, everybody loses. If New York shoots at Moscow, everybody loses. Why do you think North Korea wants nukes? Why would you think some of these other countries would want nukes? Well, because it completely changes the rules. All of a sudden North Korea has a nuke and everybody has to tiptoe around them. They can assert power like they can punch way above their weight. Punch way above their weight, that's a good saying. That's a good end slide, next slide. As we often do in this course, it's now time to break out our three sociological perspectives. Okay, so throughout this course, we've been presenting topics, and then we've been getting into how these kind of three big schools of sociological thought, the structural functionalist perspective, the conflict perspective, and the symbolic interaction perspective, how these three different perspectives make sense of this issue. So keep in mind, basically every class I make the same joke that, you're not going to win friends at a party being a structural functionalist. And the reason I always say that is, and I think that's a lame joke that I use a million times, kind of on purpose, because I think the repetitiveness of that, I hope, hammers in that idea, because a functionalist is really looking at things exist in society because they have a function. The structures of our society exist because they have a function. There's police exist because there's people that do things that they're not supposed to, and we need people to do something about it. Prisons exist because we need somewhere for them to then put those people. Right? Notice I'm not talking about rights. I'm not talking about like philosophy. I'm saying this is a situation, and there's a certain function. Okay, it's a very cold philosophy. It's not even really a philosophy. Yeah, I guess it is a philosophy, definitely. It's functionalism is definitely a philosophy. All right, but so if you're looking at it from this perspective, they're not looking at it from like poor people. They're not looking at it from the perspective of emotion at all. They're saying, well, war actually stimulates the economy. It's good for business. America goes to war. That's a lot of tanks. That's a lot of jets. That's a lot of uniforms. That's a lot of food. That's a lot of transportation. It encourages social reform. Right? It creates change. It can provide an alternative means of advancement for poor and disadvantaged. That's a nice way of looking at it. The meaner way, or the rawer way of looking at that, would be to say that basically it attracts the poor that have less options. But then again, you know, if I was growing up poor in the States, I don't know. You can see how people would go to the army is all I'm saying. You could see how people would, 3 hot meals a day, training, and then they pay for your college. Again, the cynical side of me says that's aimed to attract certain people. People that have alternative options. There's not tons and tons of people signing up that way. Although obviously it does happen. One of the influences of war is that it heavily inspires scientific and technological development. We'll be talking about that a lot today. Like the connection between industry and military is huge. And this concept we're going to be talking about now is dual technology. Okay? So dual technology just means two technologies. So just think of dual as meaning two. So two tech would mean like a type of technology that has uses in war, but also in normal life. For example, laser defense systems designed to shoot down missiles. Maybe you're creating that and you learn to use how to master laser technology that actually can be used to do something like laseric eye surgery. That wasn't the initial plan, right? But it's a dual technology. It's a technology that we're putting all this money into funding for military, and some of that research produces results, and some of those results have far-reaching effects that are beyond military. Just so I could get this to you guys, I cut out a couple of videos that I don't know if you've seen it yet, but the one I did in the digital literacy class, the one on artificial intelligence, I had so much video in that my computer like almost crashed. It took like a full day for that to save. It was like 6 gigs. So anyways, I cut out a couple videos for this just so I could get it to you quick, but one of the videos I cut out that I want you to Google is Eisenhower final address. All right, and I actually sent you a link with all those videos so you can find it. And it's the president at the time, and in his last speech, his final address to the American people, he says, I'm just going to paraphrase, but he basically makes his speech and he says, but beware of the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex. This complex, interconnected relationship between military and the industries that support military. You hear people say things like that. The Americans have to be always at war, and it's not that they're evil people. It's that it's a war machine. There's a lot of people involved. Right? There's a lot of people at Lockheed Martin making jets. The military-industrial complex is an informal alliance between a nation's military and arms industry, which supplies it, seen together as a vested interest, which influences public policy. That's the important part, which actually changes how we respond to things. Now, that's a problem, right? Because if you're like, well, maybe the fact that there's people wanting to make money off of war, if that's influencing whether we actually go to war with countries, like talk about conflict of interest. A driving factor behind this relationship between the government and defense-minded corporations is that both sides benefit. Right? The military benefits from this relationship by obtaining weapons of war. Right? The military wants to be in with Skunk Works and Lockheed Martin because they produce whatever. I don't know if they actually made the F-18, but they produce these high-end fighter jets. They must have made the F-18. And then Lockheed Martin benefits from, having these huge government contracts. It's a complex, and that's just one thing, right? Like, so look at this picture. It's like we're talking about jets, we're talking about aircraft carriers, helicopters, we're talking about tanks, we're talking about personnel vehicles, we're talking about rocket launchers, we're talking about submarines, aircraft carriers, we're talking about battleships, we're talking about all the guns, all the bullets, all the clothing, all the food, getting them there, the bases when they're there, the people that bring gas for the trucks to those places, the people that provide, I don't like the IT support. Like, it's the amount of the complex relationship between those two. Okay, so the military industrial complex is just a word that kind of means this complicated relationship between business or industry and government, but more specifically, the military wing of government. So students often get a kick out of this slide. So check out this. In the fiscal year of 2015, military spending is projected to account for 54% of all federal discretionary funding. So of all the tax money that comes into the US government that they have choice over where it goes, over half of it goes to military, totaling, almost $600 billion. Again, remember, if you had 1,000 piles of $1 million, that's $1 billion. And then times that by 600, it's almost an unreal amount of money. Military spending includes all regular activities of the Department of Defense. So this includes any kind of war spending. It includes anything related to nuclear weapons. I didn't even say that before on the last slide. We didn't even talk about the whole bombs and weapons testing and weapons facilities and keeping nukes safe and all the research and development associated with that. International military assistance, so any kind of support the states are giving in other countries, other Pentagon-related spending. That's my clean way of saying black op. Now, check out this picture. It's visually creating a visual graphic to show the difference in military spending between those countries, and I think that this picture is awesome because these are the other countries you would assume would be on the same stage or at least close to the States if you had to pick some, right? You'd pick China, Russia, maybe Britain, maybe Japan, right? The nations with the 5 largest military expenditures in the world, that's them there. Look at how the States compares. And I'm not saying this necessarily even in a critical sense. Sure, there's problems with the States. I don't want anyone else in the lead, though. I'm fine living in a world where they're the powerhouse. Again, there's always going to be problems with it. I don't know if switching the States guy to the China or the Russia guy makes anything any better, though. It's complicated. So just continuing on that idea of discretionary spending, remember I said 54% roughly of the amount of taxpayer dollars that they have choice over where it goes to the military. So now to look at how that relates to other things, look at some of this. So government, all the government employees, that's about 6%. Education, 6%. I'm not laughing, but it's just crazy that that's the case. Medicare and health, 6%. Veteran benefits, 6%. Housing, 6%. International affairs, energy and environment, science, social security, unemployment and labor, transportation, food and agriculture. All that stuff combines nowhere, not even, right? Massive amount of money. So out of $1.1 trillion, almost 600 billion of that. So remember, 1.1 trillion would be like 1,110 billion if you were to say it that way. So over half. I want to double back a second, just do a little bit more on this term dual technology. So remember I gave the example before of, developing a laser-based defense system and using that as a way to, and then all of a sudden not using that as a way to solve people's eye focus problems, or it wasn't designed for laser surgery, but it's a similar technology and it led to it. Same way as, the rush to try to create nuclear weapons created the technology available to have power plants like on The Simpsons or like in real life, or like how the Pentagon trying to create a better communication system to share information amongst themselves eventually led to the creation of things like the internet, which allowed you to watch this video right now. That's a decent segue. Sometimes I get rambly, but I just killed that segue with this ramble, but we're getting a little better. Yeah, so now check out this. So this is what's called an exoskeleton. So an exo means outside skeleton. So an exoskeleton is a skeleton that's on the outside of the body, like a lobster. But this thing, okay, so again, I took the video out, but if you guys Google a video or YouTube a video called Real Life Iron Man, and it's on that video list I gave you for chapter 14. And what it is it's this idea of the soldier puts that on, and they can all of a sudden, it basically is an artificial intelligence that can tell by the way that you're moving that there's a computer motherboard on it. They can tell by the way you're moving, when to support your knee joints, when to support your hip joints. It basically allows you to move way further distances with way less strain on the body, carrying way more weight, because that's always an issue with soldiers. It's like, okay, you need to go fight a bunch of people way over there. Now the problem is, by the time you get way over there, you're exhausted. It's no good showing up to a battle if you're basically already defeated, because by the time you get to the battle, you're done. So they needed to get their soldiers to the fight, ready to fight. Now, why I'm calling this a dual technology is you could also see how this could be super helpful for someone with something like a spinal condition. Right, you see basketball players, like if you see Kyle Lowry play basketball, you'll see that he wears like a thick padded short. So like in case he falls, so he doesn't hurt his tailbone, it's almost like if you've ever been biking and you wear those padded shorts, it's kind of like that, but even more extreme. And it's like that could be something like that. So say a kid has a spinal issue and they wear something that almost seems like a strap-on weightlifter belt, but that it actually has technology in it. I'm just saying, I could see the application for something like this. Excuse me, sorry, for people with mobility-related issues. See, now I get caught in this in-between place. That was decent, but I coughed. Keep it. It's late. It's like 2 in the morning. I can't get picky. Love you guys, but yeah, I think I'll have to just leave that cough in. You know, our friends from the conflict perspective talk about how war is rooted in antagonism. Antagonism, like one side antagonizing, egging on the other, which emerges between two or more ethnic groups or regions in the struggle for control of resources, or where they have different ideologies. Right? So, like conflict theory it's always going to be about a struggle over resources. They talk about how war benefits the corporate, military, political elites. Somebody from a conflict perspective would be a huge fan of this idea of military-industrial complex. Not a huge fan of it, a huge fan of talking about it. It'd be aligned with their critique. So within the conflict perspective, they would view this military-industrial complex as being even more than the military-industry connection. They also view it as heavily political, as it would be. But then the other interesting one is the role of media. The role of media in shaping how we see things like military. Because at a certain point the question is like, how much did me growing up in the 80s and 90s when things like G.I. Joe were super huge, how much did that affect how I view military related stuff? How much does you playing Halo affect it? Oops. I just switched slides without pressing pause on record, so I think that might make for an awkward transition. But now our friends, the symbolic interactionists, they're going to be looking at this from as you guys know, from a language perspective, the words we use, and this idea that the meanings and definitions and the way we talk about war, right? Like even if I use the word war instead of a word like conflict or engagement, conflict and engagement don't evoke the same emotions. The words matter. I'm going to show some more examples of that. Right, that they'd be interested in how since childhood we're exposed to war games and toy weapons, and it's not like we're the first generation to do this. The most extreme form of this, if you want to look into some interesting history, would be Sparta, right? Where they prioritized military preparation over everything. But we would now consider how they raised kids, child abuse. Yeah, anyways, if you guys find that interesting, I could maybe do one of these other podcasts on Sparta. I'm a nerd about that. I love that. The movie, again, like I'm talking about a war movie right now. I'm talking basically about the movie 300 right now. Right, the movies, the video games, the glorification of heroes. And at a certain point, heroes should be glorified. But what they're saying is that some of this is intentional public relations move, propaganda. Right, this language of patriotism. And again, it's not like I'm saying patriotism is wrong. And it's not like I'm saying any of this. This is what the symbolic interactionist perspective presents. Right? It's like, it doesn't sound as bad if I talk about casualties. Casualties doesn't sound as bad as dead people. Incendiary devices, that doesn't sound as bad as bombs. George Bush famously said, used the term peace heads instead of warheads on the missiles, calling the enemies insurgents. Right? It intentionally confuses things. Right? So it's like, if I run into you and I say, oh, there's a bunch of insurgent casualties, that's a little bit more vague than saying, we killed a bunch of their guys. So here's, just to give you some specific examples, these are some political words I found that were used by, I think these were all Bush. I forget when I made this list. Maybe some of these are Rumsfeld or Cheney, who were kind of his two wingmen in the what was called Operation Desert Storm at the time. Okay, calling something like an bombing a place, calling that an air campaign. Coercive interrogation, that doesn't sound quite as bad as torture. Collateral damage, instead of like, oh, we accidentally like killed a bunch of kids on mistake. Friendly fire, instead of saying, we killed some of our own on accident. Saying that you neutralized an opponent instead of saying killed. Again, these are political words and phrases. These are not about the people saying it. They're about how you're hearing it. They're hoping you're hearing it a certain way. I think it's a weird slide because it's at a certain level it's obvious. The roots of armed conflict, they're numerous. It can be lots of different things. They're complicated. They usually involve multiple things. If you try to say that Vietnam was just about communism and stopping the spread of communism, it wasn't. But it massively was. Right? That was one of the things it was about, but it wasn't the only thing it was about. Right? They often have multiple causes. Wars often related to conflict over land and other kinds of natural resources. Right? Oil. Often, most wars throughout history have probably been over things like, we really like this spot and we want to take it from you. Like, you could call that land disputes. Disputed borders, I have it on that list as. Right? So sometimes it's for control or sometimes it's for supplies. Sometimes it's for oil. Again, that'd be just a supply. Some are worried that in the future the wars might be over fresh water. Right? Because if you think about it, fresh water is one of those things that you don't really think about how important it is until the second you don't have it. So if you look at this, so like sometimes these conflicts are over values and ideologies, or ideology is just a way of saying like when an idea becomes like a philosophy or a religion, like you could say like communism. It's almost an idea turned into a religion. It's an ideology. Right? So whether it's like democracy against fascism, or whether it's capitalism versus communism, sometimes it's at this idea level, and these are difficult to respond or resolve. Right? Countries with similar belief systems are less likely to wage war against each other. For example, like Canada and let's say, for example, Britain, England, pretty unlikely that they're going to go to war. There's a lot of mutual connection. Right? Even 9/11, there's again multiple causes, multiple dynamics at play, but religious fundamentalism definitely part of it. But it is weird firing through these slides without you guys. Huh. So one of the things here is that they're saying, or sometimes war are preemptive. What's that mean? That means like preemptive means like before it happens. So it's like I catch rumor someone's about to, do something bad to me, so I do something bad to them first. We're worried that the reason I have Iraq there is like there's the big worry that they had weapons of mass destruction. They didn't want to wait till they had them and they had the ability to exert that power, so they wanted to preemptively neutralize the situation. Okay, and then there's this other security dilemma, this idea of like, we've seen this, it's like and some of you are maybe too young to have remembered travel before 2001, but it was a completely different world. And for protection and for security, a lot of the cost for that has been privacy. And the famous JFK quote, if you sacrifice privacy for security, you'll have neither. Other words you often hear in the context of war are things like revolution and civil war. Now, the difference between these two terms is somewhat technical. Often has to do with whether there's a political aspect to it. Something that's highly political is more likely to maybe be called a revolution. Although that's not always true, because the American Civil War was obviously, there's highly political things associated with that too. Okay, so these words are highly related, often result in significant political, economic, and social change. Like just think of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Russian Revolution, if you remember in the digital literacy class when we watched the Animal Farm video. Right, Civil War, you can think about the American Civil War, the Civil War tensions that have existed for a while in Ireland. The Protestant Catholic stuff. All right, more likely to occur when a government is weak or divided. If there's not a lot of order. Difficult to determine the difference between the two, between civil war and a revolution. I have here, civil wars don't always lead to large-scale social change. They don't maybe I could just say a civil war is maybe less necessarily political, although it certainly can be. I show this picture a lot, and at this point in the presentation, I've talked about, especially when I'm doing it live, I've been ranting a lot about, technology and all this politics stuff and blah blah blah, and I get away from the fact for a while that these are our young kids that we're sending to fight. These are guys about to land on D-Day. Most of them are going to die immediately. The fear in that situation, it's not a video game. That picture I showed in the last slide was from Omaha Beach, and I think I would highly recommend watching this again. I guarantee if I put this video in this PowerPoint, it gets ripped off immediately, just because this is such a popular movie and the audio would get caught. But yeah, you can read there enough to Google this. If you guys watch the Save It Private Ryan, it's basically the opening scene, and it's a crazy powerful scene, and it really, I think, does a good job of showing some of the emotion around what a situation would be like that. How psychologically traumatizing, how emotionally overwhelming. I'm gonna just keep firing through this. Some of the social problems associated with armed conflict, obviously the death and disability, the fact of the dead and wounded, the social psychological costs for the soldiers on both sides, for their families, for the people exposed to it, for the kids. This massive diversion of economic resources. Imagine over half of the states, I'll start this sentence again. Over half of their discretionary funding goes to this. Think of what else you could have spent the money on. Now again, if the states all of a sudden just stop spending money on military, I don't know I know that that's not what we want, but if it was in some situation where they didn't need to, where if, other people were playing that game too, you just think the amount of resources that could be diverted elsewhere would be incredible. And then that's not even mentioning the environmental destruction, just how hard it is on the planet. There's places in France you still can't go because of landmines. There's places in Vietnam like that too. And to just continue on this social psychological costs for kids, right? Some of the kids that grew up in the former Yugoslavia country, the countries that are, I remember growing up, Yugoslavia used to be one of the hockey teams Team Canada would play. If you're a bit younger, you may not have heard of Yugoslavia. After that country broke up, the kids there had super high rates of things like depression and anxiety and fear, and I'm sure that's true in basically all war zones. We know that in Iraq there was high amounts of cases of things like nightmares and bedwetting and withdrawal and panic attack. It's being exposed to incredible depths of trauma at an age where it's not like any of us could process it, but let alone when you're a kid. Things that's in the news a lot these days around this topic is how many soldiers are especially the Americans, that's what we hear about a lot, is how many of these soldiers are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Right now, obviously, soldiers on both sides are going to be dealing with that, and all the families, and all the people around them. Right, and I think it's interesting that sometimes post-traumatic stress disorder is because you've seen something, sometimes it's because you've done something. You're in a firefight, and all of a sudden someone comes around the corner, and they look like they have a gun, and you panic and you shoot them, and then you realize it's just a kid, and you were just some farmer from Idaho who's a relatively good guy, just wants to go home, and now you gotta live for the rest of your life knowing that you did that. dreaming about it. Of course, it's associated with things like alcoholism and aggressiveness, whether it's towards self with suicide or towards family. Right, and that devastating stat you always hear, like, I don't know if it, well, the stat is that, more American soldiers die of suicide than in war. Like, I guess that them dying in either scenario is brutal, but there's a heavy social psychological cost. I think this image here does a good job highlighting that cost. These are two hardened soldiers. One's holding the other one while he weeps. I'll keep this slide in here, and I'm gonna do I think I just had the thought that I'll do once this is all over and once we're done all the essential stuff we need to do, I might circle back and do a whole thing just on this Scientific American article around PTSD and Tetris. And actually, there's some really interesting research looking at Tetris as being an unorthodox way to help with PTSD. And the reason is because when you're playing Tetris, it involves the same part of your brain as flashbacks. It involves this like your visual spatial dimension. So actually, you rotating blocks in Tetris and you having a vivid negative memory of a dramatic event is kind of demanding the same brain resources, and actually playing Tetris can almost block some of those flashbacks. Well, this article says Tetris shown to lessen PTSD and flashbacks, and I have a link there in the presentation that you guys have. Okay, in addition to all the horror that happens at a personal level, it's also this idea of just how much of a waste of money it is, the diversion of economic resources towards this. Warfare requires enormous capital, enormous money, enormous amount of human resources, whether that's actually the soldiers or everything that goes around organizing. Right, and that money's coming from somewhere. It's being diverted or taken from other areas that it could be going to. For these next two slides, we're almost done. For these next two slides, let's make up a hypothetical situation where, say, the States and England are in disagreement over something that's very significant. All right, and it might lead to conflict. And say Canada's trying to cool things down, and they're playing like they're the guy at the bar trying to get between the two drunk guys, saying, come on guys, but at a country level. Mediation is a non-violent strategy used to resolve conflict and stop or prevent war, where a neutral third party intervenes and facilitates negotiation between representatives or leaders of conflicting groups. So basically there's this side over here, there's this side over here, and somebody's mediating, someone's standing in the middle mediating and trying to help things work. Okay, so that's mediation. A related word is arbitration, but arbitration is basically the same thing, but just that third party person trying to break up the fight has more power. So now this is a scenario where, say, England has this problem with the States, and the States has this problem with England, and they both explain it to me as Canada, and my job is to make the decision then. Right? You hear this word arbitration in hockey and in sports. You'll see like the Leafs and this player in arbitration, and that means that like the Leafs say what they want to pay, the guy says what he wants, and then some third party, some person is being paid to arbitrate, to make the decision. A nonviolent strategy used to resolve conflict and to stop or prevent war, where a neutral third party in arbitration arrives at a decision that the two parties agree in advance to accept. So it's not like the arbitrator comes up with an idea and then he's like, okay, do you guys agree to this? No, in advance, the agreement is that the arbitrator will come to an understanding and that will be what people go with. It's the same thing as mediation, except arbitration, there's that added component of in advance agreeing that they're going to go with whatever this person suggests. example of this kind of thing working would be something like the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So non-proliferation just means not making any more. Not don't proliferate it. Don't make it grow. This was signed in 1970. So this, is related to ending some of these Cold War conflicts. Not like the states in America are even cool now, but this was signed in 1970 between the states and former Soviet Union, which we now call Russia. Right, since it has extended to other countries, including countries like Britain and France. This is kind of interesting. In class, I'll usually, if I'm doing this, I'll get students to guess what countries they think have nukes. Right, most people guess the States and Russia and China and Israel. Usually UK. France is usually a harder one. India and Pakistan people usually don't get. And then now you have to, unfortunately, include North Korea on that list, which is a destabilizing factor, and that's why that was such a big thing in the news. Okay, next slide. So these last 3 slides are just going to basically be quick shout-outs to different documentaries that's saying that I guess I can't embed that video. It doesn't matter. I wasn't going to anyways. But this Waging Peace, Canadians in Afghanistan, is actually a pretty good documentary, even though it just crashed on me in the moment. But I would check it out. If you just use that title into YouTube, you can find it. Oh, here's another link to a devastating movie, Shake Hands with the Devil. This is about what happened in Rwanda. And terrible, terrible, terrible situation. But an important movie, and one I would recommend putting on your list. Finally, guys, this is another really tough one to watch, but Invisible Children, Discover the Unseen is a heartbreaking look at, well, the fact that a lot of these soldiers we're talking about are actually kids. And the poorer the country, as a general rule, the more true that is. That's not necessarily true, but in some of these really poor countries, and especially when drugs are involved, it can be a really scary situation to be a kid in that context. Alright guys, on that super depressive note, I'm going to end this. I don't have a great uplifting thing to say here, but I'll do that in a different video. Alright, I'm going to end on the mood that is probably fitting for an ending for this presentation, and we will go from here. Alright, love you guys. Cheers.